It's hard to be the bard.
The Misuse of Shakespeare.
A presentation by Emma Anderson
and Haley Kiernan.
Do you remember how you felt in your high school English class when your teacher told you you'd be studying Shakespeare?
If it was dreadful, it probably looks something like this. To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer.
If you were excited, it probably went something like, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer.
Well, there's a reason behind that.
If you were passionate in your reading of Shakespeare in class, chances are you were either a theater kid or a genuine admirer of Shakespeare who enjoyed his plays outside of class.
If the experience of reading Shakespeare aloud in class was more like pulling teeth for you, there is no need to feel guilty about that.
According to Stephen Brown in his Why Shakespeare? Because it's 2016 TED Talk, Shakespeare never intended for his plays to be begrudgingly read by high school students who have no other choice.
They were meant to be performed.
Yet, if this is the case, then why does Shakespeare continue to be a part of high school curriculums?
We believe this all has to do with the traditional rhetoric agenda.
Before we dive into this, it would be a good idea to define rhetoric for you.
According to the Oxford English Dictionary, rhetoric is defined as the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the exploitation of figures in speech and other compositional techniques. But the truth is, rhetoric has no one true definition because it varies based on the different cultures and histories surrounding it.
The definition chosen vaguely represents the traditional Western European mold of rhetoric in defining it directly as the power of persuasion in speech or writing. And while there's nothing wrong with this version of rhetoric itself,
its presence has overpowered and erased multicultural forms of rhetoric and still continues to overshadow it, despite the efforts of repairing the damage with techniques such as a language of survivance.
Those who support this traditional rhetoric agenda tend to be westernized, elitist males. Most of the rhetoric that is typically taught is either created or endorsed by these men.
Whenever one thinks of the term rhetoric, their mind probably goes to imagining men in togas and grape leaves back in ancient Greece. As students of rhetoric, this is what we thought until a couple of months ago when we took Writing 360, rhetoric for writing majors.
We were all ashamed of ourselves when we found out that the first written rhetoric was actually a woman named Meheduana. She was the high priestess in ancient Mesopotamia who wrote a bunch of poetry.
Shortly after the shame, we became angry. We could not believe that we were fed the idea for all of our education that rhetoric was started by men back in ancient Greece.
We also watched Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk entitled The Danger of a Single Story. She also expressed her feelings of shame when she was faced with the realities that did not match her perception of the world she learned through reading.
We believe that continuing to teach Shakespeare in the classroom is in danger of creating an irreversible single story.
Think about it. Shakespeare, he was white, male, elite, and most definitely Western. We believe this criteria is what made him such an easy candidate for abuse in school classrooms. Good old Bill had no intentions on being the subject of a high school senior's final essay. He had no intentions on being anything but a bard. But one thing all history majors like me know is that in history, white men always got to step up their game at making things all about them.
These are the men who decided Shakespeare needed to be taken off the stage and onto the page. Thanks a lot.
But we are here as women and students to proclaim him as a playwright, and only a playwright.
The both of us love Shakespeare, and as much as we personally loved reading his plays in class, we both realized that this was not the time or the place to appreciate his genius. In fact, studying his works in the classroom had the exact opposite effect of seeing his work live, or at least on a crummy television screen rather than black and white text.
So what about the people who say that it is still important to teach Shakespeare in school because a lot of the themes in his plays are still prevalent to modern life?
We'll answer this with another question. Who says learning stops in school?
Going to see a Shakespeare play or watching a film adaptation on one's own time is so much better than droning through that one monologue people won't shut up about in class, line by line.
We suggest that high school and college syllabi wipe out teaching Shakespeare and are redesigned to include more diverse, multicultural works. And no, Othello doesn't count.
As to who exactly should be studied, that's up to you.
We want to emphasize the fact that everyone's voice matters, regardless of origin, status, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, language, or disability.
After all, Shakespeare did say, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players."
So let's do right by Shakespeare by honoring his famous phrase and using his works the way he originally intended and not the way traditional rhetoric wants.